The cruelest cold does not come from the winter frost, but from the turned backs of those who share your blood. But sometimes, being passed into the dark is the only way to find an eternal flame. It was Christmas Eve. The temperature outside had plummeted to a bitter 9 degrees Fahrenheit, but the true freezing point was happening right inside the living room. Elias Caldwell, a man of 74 years, with hands heavily calloused by decades of heavy machinery and dark engine grease, stood perfectly still. Beside him was Clara, his wife of 54 years, a woman whose quiet strength had been the unshakable backbone of their existence. For over half a century, they had poured every ounce of their youth, every drop of their sweat, and every single cent of their social security into the foundation of the man standing before them, Vincent, their 48-year-old son. The boy Elias used to carry on his broad shoulders across miles of sun-baked fields was completely gone. In his place stood a cold stranger in a tailored suit, his eyes remarkably flat, his posture defensive. Next to him stood Lorraine, a woman whose expensive designer perfume could not mask the vile stench of her impatience. They had just delivered the news. The house had been sold. The paperwork was finalized. "You have to understand, you two are becoming a sickly burden," Vincent said smoothly, looking away from his father. A sickly burden. Those 3 words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Lorraine tapped her leather boots against the hardwood floor, a beautiful floor Elias had sanded and polished on his own hands and knees. "The movers will be here in 20 minutes to clear this space, so we suggest you pack what you need right now," Lorraine chimed in, her voice clipped and devoid of any humanity. Elias did not scream. He did not beg. He did not drop to his knees or shed a single tear of self-pity. He simply looked at them. His silence was a towering mountain, casting a long, immovable shadow over their petty greed. He looked at the son he had bled for, remembering the thousands of overtime hours in the sweltering factory, the skipped meals, the worn-out work boots that had carried him through decades of silent sacrifice. Clara gently placed a weathered hand on her husband's arm. She did not weep. She simply nodded with immense dignity. They walked into their bedroom, the room where they had dreamed of growing old together, and pulled out 2 battered leather suitcases. They folded their modest clothes with meticulous care, leaving behind the fine china, the expensive electronics, the comforts of a life they had built from scratch. They took only their dignity. Walking back into the living room, Elias stopped directly in front of Vincent. The son flinched slightly, expecting a physical strike, expecting a loud curse, expecting the righteous wrath of a betrayed father. "I forgive you, for carrying anger is far too heavy a burden for an old man," Elias stated calmly, his voice steady and deeply resonant. Vincent opened his mouth to speak, but the sheer weight of his father's composure crushed whatever pathetic excuse he was about to offer. Elias turned the brass doorknob. The wind howled furiously, whipping 6 inches of fresh snow across the wooden porch. He stepped out into the blinding white night, Clara right by his side, their 2 heavy suitcases serving as their only anchors in the violent storm. The heavy oak door clicked shut. They were gone. The grueling walk to the nearest transit stop felt like a death march across an alien tundra. The wind cut through Elias's faded wool coat like a serrated blade, but he kept his back straight. Every step through the rapidly accumulating snow required immense physical effort, his worn boots sinking deep into the freezing white drifts. Clara leaned into him, her breathing shallow but steady.
They did not speak of the horrific betrayal. They did not curse the dark heavens above. They simply moved forward, putting one foot in front of the other, surviving the night through sheer willpower. They rode the city bus in absolute silence. The heater was completely broken. Outside the frosted windows, the city was alive with the bright glow of Christmas lights, happy families laughing behind frost-kissed glass, little children unwrapping gifts by crackling fires. Inside the bus, it was just the steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic thud of the tires against the icy asphalt. They arrived at a dilapidated motel on the far outskirts of the county line. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, two of its letters completely burnt out. The room they managed to rent was painfully small, smelling of damp carpet and stale smoke. The rusty radiator let out a pathetic wheezing hiss, barely raising the room temperature past 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Elias sat on the edge of the sagging mattress. He reached into his deep coat pocket, his numb, calloused fingers searching the bottom. He pulled out his hand and slowly opened his palm. $18. It was a crumpled $10 bill, a faded $5 bill, and three extremely worn-out $1 bills. This was the grand total of his life savings, the absolute sum of 54 years of relentless labor and unconditional love. This was what remained after a lifetime of giving everything. Clara sat beside him, wrapping her thin arms around her chest. She looked at the money, then up at his face. The deep lines around his eyes spoke of a fatigue that ran deeper than bone, but there was no defeat in his posture. "I will go to the vending machine," he murmured softly, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. He walked down the dimly lit corridor, feeding $3 into the humming machine, retrieving 2 packets of dry biscuits and a single styrofoam cup of bitter coffee. They sat together at the small, wobbly wooden table. Elias broke the dry biscuits in half, handing the larger pieces to Clara. They sipped the scalding, cheap coffee in absolute silence, letting the meager warmth spread through their freezing bodies. They had been stripped of their home, their life savings, and the illusion of family. But they were not broken. Elias looked out the frosted window, watching the heavy snow continue to fall. His mind was incredibly sharp, his spirit forged in the roaring furnaces of old factories, hardened by decades of sweat and discipline. He knew that the morning would come, and with it the absolute necessity to survive. Then the silence of the room was shattered. It was loud, it was jarring. The ancient rotary telephone sitting on the dusty nightstand began to ring. Elias stared at the yellowed plastic device. Nobody knew they were here, yet it rang again, a shrill, piercing sound that cut through the agonizing silence of the freezing room. Sitting in a cheap motel room with the bone-chilling cold seeping through the walls and 18 pitiful dollars crumpled in his pocket, Elias had absolutely no idea that the piercing ring of that telephone was about to unlock a legacy that had been frozen solid for 70 years.
Elias picked up the heavy plastic receiver. "Hello?" he said simply, his voice a steady gravel path. On the other end of the crackling line was a voice thick with age and formal education. It was Theodore Vance, an attorney calling from a place hundreds of miles away in a small, snow-buried town in the rugged mountains of Vermont. The lawyer asked for Clara, explaining through a thick haze of static that she was the sole bloodline relative of a woman named Eleanor Sterling. It was a distant aunt, a phantom from the deep past, who had left behind a massive stone property known to the locals as the Sterling Mansion. There was a strict condition. They had to claim the physical deed and the keys in person at the county office within 3 days. If they failed to cross the state lines and present themselves by the absolute deadline, the county would completely seize the estate for unpaid historical taxes. Elias gently placed the receiver back onto the cradle. He looked at his wife. He looked at the $18 resting quietly on the cheap laminate table. The journey would require crossing through the absolute worst winter storm of the decade, driving through blinding whiteouts and treacherous mountain passes in a vehicle that had seen its best days decades ago. It was sheer madness. "Pack your coat," Elias murmured softly, handing Clara the last piece of the dry biscuit. They walked out into the biting dawn, carrying their 2 heavy suitcases toward the edge of the motel parking lot where Elias had parked his battered 1994 pickup truck. The rusted door hinges groaned loudly as he pulled the heavy metal open. The seats cracked and stiff from the freezing night air. The engine turned over with a violent, terrifying shudder, coughing plumes of dark exhaust into the falling snow before finally catching a steady, rhythmic idle. They drove north. For 2 agonizing days, Elias gripped the cracked steering wheel, his calloused hands fighting against the fierce crosswinds that threatened to push the heavy truck right off the icy highway. The heater blew a pathetic stream of lukewarm air, barely melting the thick frost building up on the inside of the windshield. They measured their progress not in time, but in the grueling miles stretching endlessly before them, navigating through 50-mile-per-hour wind gusts and nearly 30 inches of heavy, unyielding snow. They survived on stale gas station coffee and sheer willpower. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, the tired truck finally rolled into the small, isolated town of Pine Ridge. The settlement was swallowed by towering pine trees and immense snow-capped peaks, looking exactly like a forgotten outpost at the edge of the civilized world. Elias parked the truck. He shut off the ignition. The silence was heavy. Inside the heavily heated municipal building, the air smelled of stale paper and cheap floor wax. Elias and Clara walked up to the front desk, their clothes deeply wrinkled, their boots leaving wet puddles on the faded linoleum floor. When Elias spoke the name of the Sterling mansion, the 2 clerks behind the thick security glass exchanged a very specific, knowing look. It was a look of profound pity. "You folks drove all this way for that icy grave?" the older clerk asked incredulously, her voice dripping with condescending sympathy. "That stone beast has been sitting empty and frozen solid for over 40 years, just collecting ice and rot." Elias did not offer an explanation. He did not complain about his traitorous son or the brutal, bone-breaking journey. He reached into his worn coat pocket with absolute dignity and pulled out his neatly folded money. He separated the single $10 bill from the 5 and the 3 ones. He slid the crisp $10 bill under the glass partition. "The administrative fee is exactly $7, Elias stated firmly, his eyes locking on to the clerk. The clerk sighed, took the money, and handed back 3 crinkled $1 bills, along with a small manila envelope. Inside the envelope was a single, heavy brass key, thoroughly blackened by decades of oxidation and neglect. It was the cheapest, most pathetic transaction for a piece of real estate the county had ever seen, a mere $7 to inherit a crumbling nightmare that everyone else believed was entirely worthless. Elias took the key. They walked back out into the bitter wind, leaving the warm courthouse and the whispering clerks behind. They drove the final 3 miles up a steep, winding mountain road, the truck tires spinning and fighting for every single inch of traction until the dense tree line finally broke. There, looming against the dark gray sky, was the Sterling mansion. It was a colossal fortress of dark gray stone, completely buried under massive drifts of snow, its windows dark and lifeless like the eyes of a sleeping giant. Elias parked the truck. He stepped out into the knee-deep snow, feeling the biting wind clawed his exposed face. He walked up the wide, sweeping stone steps, standing before the towering oak doors.
The brass lock was frozen solid, covered in a thick layer of ice. Elias took off his heavy leather glove, pressed his bare, warm thumb against the frozen metal, and waited patiently until the ice began to weep and melt away. He inserted the rusty brass key, feeling the heavy internal tumblers resist, before finally turning with a loud mechanical clank. Ignoring the mockery of the world, Elias pushed the heavy oak door of the Sterling mansion, and under the thick dust of time, he instantly recognized a historical breath waiting to be awakened.
The heavy oak door swung inward with a prolonged, agonizing groan, echoing fiercely through the cavernous darkness of the grand foyer. The air inside was trapped, stagnant, and shockingly colder than the raging blizzard outside, a deep, settling chill that tasted of dry dust, rusted metal, and forgotten decades. Elias and Clara stepped over the threshold, their worn boots leaving the very first footprints on a floor untouched by human life for 40 years. The sheer scale of the Sterling mansion was intimidating. Massive sweeping staircases, easily 12 feet wide, disappeared into the pitch-black shadows of the upper floors, while tall, arched windows were completely obscured by thick layers of frost and grime. Only a pale, ghostly sliver of winter light managed to filter into the vast, freezing space. The internal temperature hovered at a brutal 12 degrees Fahrenheit, causing their breath to hang in the air like thick white smoke. "Watch your step," Elias cautioned quietly, his voice swallowed instantly by the immense, dead volume of the room. Most men would have looked at the peeling wallpaper, the heavy cobwebs hanging thick as woolen drapes, and the overwhelming, freezing darkness, and felt nothing but absolute despair. They would have seen a ruined, worthless shell of a house, a financial nightmare meant only for the wrecking ball. Elias saw something else entirely. He stripped off his heavy winter coat, standing in his faded flannel shirt despite the freezing cold, and began to walk the perimeter of the grand halls with the practiced, calculating eye of a veteran factory mechanic. He pressed his deeply calloused hands against the towering walls, feeling the bone-deep chill of the massive limestone blocks that held the structure together. The foundation was an absolute fortress. There were no hairline fractures running along the masonry, no weeping moisture stains near the baseboards, and no crumbling mortar turning to powder. The structural integrity was mathematically perfect, standing defiant and unyielding against 70 years of brutal mountain weather. He knelt slowly, his stiff joints popping in the quiet room, and tapped his heavy knuckles against the exposed hardwood floorboards, listening intently to the deep reverberation. Solid oak, not a single hollow thud, not a single trace of termite damage, wood rot, or warping. The bones of this colossal house were incredibly strong, built in a bygone era when craftsmanship meant absolute permanence, waiting patiently for a man who understood the silent, stoic language of honest labor. Clara moved quietly through the adjacent dining room, her heavy, experienced eyes scanning the long, heavy mahogany tables and the intricate ceiling molding. She did not complain about the freezing temperature biting at her fingers. She did not lament their desperate, impoverished situation. She simply assessed the vast amount of intense cleaning required with the quiet dignity of a woman preparing for war. They ventured deeper into the belly of the house, navigating a long, narrow servant corridor that led toward the rear kitchens. Clara pushed open a heavy wooden door, her heavy brass flashlight piercing the pitch-black void of a massive, windowless walk-in pantry. She gasped softly. "Elias, look at this!" she called out, her voice echoing with a rare note of genuine astonishment. Row upon row of heavy metal shelving stretched from the dusty floor all the way to the 12-foot ceiling, groaning under the weight of survival.
The shelves were heavily laden with hundreds of sealed glass mason jars, vacuum-packed bags of dry grains, and heavy 4-pound tins of preserved goods. Elias walked up slowly, reaching out to wipe a thick layer of gray dust from a large tin of preserved peaches. The faded paper label read 1987. It was a profound revelation. The distant Aunt Eleanor had not simply abandoned this immense estate to the ravages of time. She had systematically and carefully prepared it. She had stockpiled enough non-perishable food to sustain a large family through the harshest of winters, quietly laying the groundwork for whoever would eventually inherit her grand legacy. She knew with absolute certainty that the person who finally arrived with the brass key would need sustenance to survive the brutal resurrection of the mansion. But preserved food could not stop the freezing cold from claiming their lives tonight. Elias grabbed the heavy flashlight from his wife and descended the steep, crumbling concrete stairs into the subterranean basement. The air down here was incredibly thick, heavy with the sharp scent of old motor oil, damp earth, and oxidized iron. At the center of the cavernous room sat the heart of the beast. It was a massive, industrial-grade coal and oil furnace, weighing easily over 6,000 pounds. It was a terrifying behemoth of cast iron, heavy steel pipes, and complex pressure valves that looked like it belonged deep in the engine room of a naval battleship rather than a residential home. It completely dead, entombed in 40 years of oily grime, thick black soot, and neglect. Elias did not hesitate. He crawled right under the heavy iron belly of the machine, completely ignoring the thick black sludge that instantly stained his shirt and seeped deep into the pores of his skin. He wedged his broad shoulders tightly against the freezing concrete floor, shining the bright beam of light directly into the dark, complex mechanical guts of the rusted burner assembly. His calloused hands traced the hardened copper fuel lines, diagnosing the dried rubber gaskets, the completely jammed blower fan, and the heavily corroded electrical ignition switch. This was his true domain, the unforgiving world of heavy iron, grease, and mechanical truth. He felt the weight of the massive cast iron above his chest, calculating the exact leverage needed to break the rusted bolts free. He knew exactly what had to be done. The immense limestone framework could undoubtedly last forever, but to breathe fire back into a colossal castle with nothing but his bare, aging hands? Elias closed his eyes, took a deep breath of the freezing metallic air, and prepared to enter the most punishing, brutal labor of his entire life.
For 3 relentless, grueling days, the subterranean basement of the Sterling mansion became a punishing purgatory of freezing temperatures and unyielding iron. Elias lay flat on his tired back upon the merciless, freezing concrete floor, surrounded by a chaotic scattering of heavily rusted wrenches, heavily oxidized wire brushes, and thick cotton rags soaked in harsh chemical solvents. His thick, calloused knuckles were completely raw, bleeding sluggishly into the thick layer of black grease that coated his trembling hands. The ambient temperature down in the stone pit hovered brutally at a life-threatening 17 degrees Fahrenheit, turning every single exhalation into a thick plume of white vapor that hung lazily in the stagnant air. He did not utter a single complaint. He simply wiped the stinging sweat and black soot from his burning eyes with the back of his filthy forearm, gripped the heavy 3/4-inch steel wrench, and applied over 200 pounds of raw bodily torque to a stubborn brass fitting. The rusted metal shrieked loudly in the dead silence of the cellar, finally giving way with a violent snap that sent Elias's knuckles crashing hard against the jagged iron casing of the massive burner. A fresh cut opened across his weathered skin. He ignored the sharp, radiating pain entirely. He meticulously disassembled the heavy cast-iron fuel pump, soaking the hardened rubber diaphragms in a small tin of penetrating oil, using a tiny improvised metal pick to scrape away 40 years of hardened carbon buildup from the delicate brass ignition nozzles. He measured the gap of the spark electrodes, adjusting them to exactly 1/8 of an inch with absolute unwavering precision. The machine was a stubborn, ancient beast, but Elias was far more stubborn. 2 floors above him, in the grand, sweeping foyer of the mansion, Clara was waging her own silent, agonizing war against the relentless march of time. At 72 years old, an age when most women were sitting comfortably by a warm fireplace or being waited on by attentive staff, she was down on her aching, arthritic knees. She dragged a heavy 5-gallon galvanized steel bucket filled with freezing, soapy water across the vast expanse of the checkerboard marble floor. Her thin, frail hands gripped a heavy, stiff-bristled scrub brush, attacking relentlessly at the thick, blackened layers of hardened grime, muddy footprints from decades past, and the sticky residue of a house left entirely to rot. Every single movement was absolute agony. Her lower back screamed with sharp, stabbing pains, and her joints stiffened fiercely in the freezing, 20-degree draft that howled through the poorly sealed, 12-foot-tall window frames. Yet her face remained perfectly composed, a mask of sheer, unbreakable stoicism. She moved methodically, covering every square inch of the enormous 400-square-foot entrance hall, wringing out the heavy cotton mop until her knuckles turned a stark, bruised purple. She did not weep for her lost comfort. She did not harbor bitter, poisonous thoughts about the luxurious, heavily heated condominium her traitorous son was likely sitting in at that very moment. She focused entirely on the beautiful white veins of the Italian marble slowly revealing themselves beneath the thick layers of dark filth. She simply scrubbed. She wrung out the black water. She scrubbed again. By the late afternoon of the 4th day, a profound, earth-shattering sound reverberated through the colossal stone bones of the mansion. It began as a low, mechanical whine, building into a rhythmic, heavy thumping, and culminating in a massive, explosive whoosh of ignition. The beast was finally awake. Deep inside the basement, Elias stood before the massive 6,000-pound cast-iron furnace, watching the bright, violent orange flames roaring fiercely inside the combustion chamber. The thick, heavy steel pipes began to clank and groan loudly, expanding as pressurized hot water finally rushed through the long-dead circulatory system of the immense estate. The massive iron radiators on the upper floors hissed and sputtered, slowly radiating a beautiful, life-saving heat that began to push the deadly winter chill back into the freezing wilderness outside. From the snow-covered valley of Pine Ridge, the locals looked up toward the high mountain ridge and saw something that completely stopped them in their tracks. A thick, steady column of dark gray smoke was billowing triumphantly from the towering stone chimney of the Sterling mansion. The rumor had already spread through the small, tightly knit community like wildfire. The clerks at the county courthouse had whispered about the fragile, impoverished, elderly couple who had spent their last $7 to claim the cursed frozen tomb. Everyone had fully expected them to freeze to death within the first 48 hours, victims of their own foolish desperation and the brutal, unforgiving Vermont winter. But the towering smoke proved they were still breathing. Down in the town square, Evelyn, a heavily built, warm-hearted woman who owned the small local diner, wiped her hands on her stained apron and stared up at the mountain. She knew the deadly reality of a mountain winter. She turned around, marched directly into her commercial kitchen, and began packing heavy, insulated metal thermoses with thick, boiling beef stew, roasted root vegetables, and dozens of freshly baked buttered rolls.
She was not the only one. 3 local carpenters, rough men with thick beards and hands heavily scarred by spinning saw blades, loaded the back of a heavy-duty pickup truck with half a cord of perfectly seasoned dry oak firewood. They drove the steep, treacherous 3-mile road, their heavy steel snow chains biting aggressively into the thick ice, determined to check on the insane elders who had awakened the sleeping giant. When they pushed open the heavy oak doors of the mansion, they froze in sheer astonishment. The foyer was no longer a dark, terrifying tomb of dust and decay. The magnificent marble floor gleamed brilliantly, reflecting the soft, warm light of a dozen kerosene lanterns Clara had carefully placed along the sweeping staircase. The heavy mahogany paneling had been polished to a rich, warm shine, and there, standing in the center of the vast space, were Elias and Clara. They looked incredibly small, deeply exhausted and covered in black soot and gray dust, but they stood with the towering, inassailable dignity of royalty in a grand palace. Evelyn stepped forward carefully, holding the heavy basket of steaming food. "We saw the smoke from the valley," Evelyn said softly, her voice carrying a deep, undeniable reverence. "We thought you folks might need a proper meal and some dry wood to keep that old boiler fed." Elias stepped forward, his dark, grease-stained hands resting naturally at his sides. "We cannot pay you," he stated firmly, his voice rumbling like the very stones of the house. "We do not accept charity, ma'am." Evelyn smiled gently, a warm, knowing expression that melted the remaining tension in the room. "It is not charity, Mr. Caldwell," she replied smoothly, setting the heavy basket down on the clean marble floor. "It is just neighborly respect for honest, hard-working folks. You two have done more to this cursed place in 4 days than this entire county has managed to do in 40 long years." The locals unloaded the heavy oak logs, stacking them neatly by the massive living room fireplace, and quietly departed, leaving the old couple to the profound, healing silence of their newly warmed sanctuary. The ambient temperature inside the massive stone walls had finally climbed to a comfortable 65 degrees Fahrenheit. For the first time in over a week, Elias and Clara could actually take off their heavy, damp winter coats without violently shivering.
They sat together on a beautifully carved wooden bench, eating the hot, savory beef stew in absolute silence, tasting the incredible, overwhelming flavor of simple human kindness. Their bodies were utterly battered, but their spirits were forged steel. The grueling labor did not stop just because their stomachs were full and the house was warm. The next morning, Clara moved her meticulous, uncompromising cleaning efforts into the east wing of the sprawling estate, pushing open the towering double doors of the grand library.
It was a breathtaking, cavernous sanctuary of knowledge. Massive, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, constructed of solid, dark walnut, lined all 4 towering walls, completely filled with thousands upon thousands of leather-bound volumes, historical encyclopedias, and ancient, heavy manuscripts. The scent of old paper, dry leather binding, and settling dust was incredibly thick. The room spanned an impressive 40 feet in length and 30 feet in width, containing more literary history than the entire town public library. Clara tied a faded cotton bandana around her silver hair, grabbed her soft, feathered dusting brush, and began the monumental, exhausting task of cleaning the endless rows of forgotten literature. She worked for 6 solid hours. She climbed the heavy, rolling wooden ladder, dragging her tired, aching arms across shelf after shelf, knocking away thick spider webs and blowing away 40 years of gray accumulated skin cells and airborne dirt. She reached the very top shelf of the darkest, most isolated corner of the immense room, wiping down a long row of heavy, identical encyclopedias from the late 19th century. She reached out and grasped the spine of a dark green, unlabeled book. She pulled it gently to wipe behind it. It did not move. Clara frowned slightly, adjusting her footing on the wooden ladder. She wrapped her thin fingers tightly around the heavy leather spine and pulled harder. The book was completely locked in place, firmly fused to the wooden shelf by some unseen force. But the strange thing was not its resistance, it was the texture. As her thumb pressed hard against the side of the thick leather binding, she felt something entirely wrong. The friction was completely unnatural. It was not the soft, yielding texture of aged paper or dried cowhide leather. It was completely rigid, utterly unyielding, and completely cold to the touch. It was solid steel, meticulously painted and textured to mimic a leather-bound book perfectly. Her heart skipped a single heavy beat. She wrapped her entire hand around the fake spine and, acting on a sudden, unexplainable instinct, she pushed the book backward into the dark recess of the wooden shelf. A sharp, metallic click echoed loudly. It was the sound of heavy, precision engineering cutting fiercely through the dead silence of the massive library. Instantly, a deep, terrifying, rumbling vibration began to shake the very floorboards beneath the rolling ladder. Clara gasped softly, gripping the wooden rails tightly as the massive 12-foot-wide section of the dark walnut bookcase slowly, mechanically began to swing outward on massive, hidden iron hinges. A wave of stale, incredibly cold air washed over her face. The house was finally warm, but as Clara stared into the pitch-black, narrow passageway that had just revealed itself behind the heavy wooden shelves, she realized they were about to step into a chilling mystery that had been intentionally sealed away for nearly an entire century. "Elias," Clara called out, her voice perfectly steady but carrying a sharp edge that sliced completely through the quiet air. He appeared exactly 2 minutes later, a heavy iron wrench still gripped firmly in his right hand. He stopped at the threshold of the grand library, his dark eyes immediately locking onto the gaping black hole in the intricate walnut woodwork. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply walked to his wife, raised the heavy brass flashlight, and pointed the bright beam directly into the dark void. It was a secret architectural vein. The hidden passageway was exactly 36 inches wide, built with rough-hewn pine boards that had never seen a single coat of paint or varnish. A steep, narrow wooden staircase disappeared completely into the absolute pitch-black shadows of the upper architecture. "Bring the heavy lantern," Clara commanded softly. They ascended into the unknown. With every single step, the dry wooden stairs groaned violently under their weight, releasing tiny clouds of gray dust that had settled entirely undisturbed for nearly a century. The air grew incredibly thin and drastically colder, dropping rapidly back down to a biting 40 degrees Fahrenheit the higher they climbed into the uninsulated, forgotten peaks of the massive mansion. They reached the top landing. The narrow staircase opened abruptly into a small, windowless chamber hidden deep within the sprawling attic space directly beneath the sharply pitched slate roof. There were no discarded cardboard boxes, no antique furniture covered in white cotton sheets, no forgotten family heirlooms gathering dust. There was only the vault. It was a colossal, terrifying cube of forged steel, standing exactly 7 feet tall and measuring 6 feet across. It sat directly on top of massive reinforced steel beams that had been specifically integrated into the wooden framework of the house just to support its immense, crushing weight. Elias stepped forward, running his calloused hand over the freezing, dark gray metal. He instantly recognized the heavy industrial riveting, the massive internal hinges, and the thick, impenetrable door that belonged inside a Federal Reserve Bank, not a residential mountain home. "It is completely impenetrable," Elias muttered quietly, his eyes scanning the incredibly tight steel seams. "No drill or torch will ever break this iron shell." In the exact center of the heavy steel door sat a massive, solid brass combination dial. Clara walked up to the towering metal beast. She did not possess the profound mechanical brilliance of her husband, but her mind held something far more valuable in this specific moment. She possessed the quiet, meticulous memory of a woman who had spent decades honoring family history, organizing forgotten photo albums, and remembering the dead with immense respect. She stared at the cold brass dial. Eleanor Sterling was an incredibly private, deeply paranoid woman, but she loved exactly one thing in this entire world, Clara whispered softly, her eyes narrowing as she recalled the ancient family records. Her late husband. She reached out and gripped the heavy brass wheel. August 14th, 1909, Clara stated with absolute, unshakable certainty. She rotated the heavy brass dial. She spun it entirely to the left, stopping precisely on the number 8. She reversed the motion, spinning the heavy wheel to the right, listening to the deep, heavy internal tumblers sliding into place, stopping firmly on 14. She turned it left again, landing dead on 0. Finally, she brought it back to the right, resting the small engraved arrow perfectly on the number 9. She grasped the massive steel lever. She pushed down with all her remaining strength. A loud, deafening clank shattered the attic silence. The internal locking bolts, thick steel cylinders weighing dozens of pounds each, violently retracted into the heavy door. Elias quickly stepped forward, grabbing the cold metal lever alongside his wife, pulling backward with his broad, muscular shoulders. The massive steel door, weighing easily over 2,000 pounds, glided open on perfectly balanced ball bearings with absolutely zero friction. They shined the bright flashlight into the dark steel cavern. The sight completely paralyzed them. There were no cobwebs, no dirt, no decay inside the hermetically sealed chamber. Lined perfectly on the heavy steel shelves were objects that aggressively reflected the bright, piercing beam of the flashlight, throwing a warm, blinding golden glow across the small, freezing attic room. It was gold. Exactly 50 solid gold bars rested side by side, each one stamped with heavy federal insignias, each measuring exactly 7 inches long and weighing roughly 27 pounds. Below the heavy metal ingots sat rows of antique wooden lockboxes. Elias pulled one open, revealing thousands of perfectly preserved, incredibly rare numismatic coins, heavy silver dollars, shining gold double eagles, and completely uncirculated copper pennies from the late 19th century. But the true treasure was not the heavy metal. On the very bottom shelf sat a small, unassuming black metal lockbox containing a single sealed envelope resting directly on top of a massive, heavily bound stack of intricately engraved parchment paper. Clara picked up the thick envelope, breaking the hardened red wax seal with her thumb. She pulled out a single sheet of heavy cotton paper, covered entirely in elegant, sweeping cursive handwriting. She held the flashlight steady, her eyes scanning the deeply faded ink. To the one who stood in the freezing dark and chose to build a fire. I watched the banks completely collapse in 1929. I watched proud, honest men jump from towering windows when the paper money turned to absolute ash. I converted everything. I locked it away in the absolute dark, waiting patiently for someone who possessed the strength to survive the cold and the heart to protect what truly matters. Clara slowly lowered the heavy parchment. She looked down at the massive stack of intricately engraved papers resting inside the black box. They were not ordinary banking documents, trivial real estate deeds, or simple corporate stock certificates. They were beautifully printed, high-denomination bearer bonds, perfectly preserved from a forgotten era of American finance. Bearer bonds meant there was no registered owner, no digital trace, no complicated legal transfer required to claim the fortune. They were treated exactly like cold, hard cash, meaning whoever physically held the heavy paper in their hands instantly, completely, and legally owned the absolute totality of the wealth. But the true, staggering value of these ancient papers, multiplying silently in the dark for over 70 years with compounding historical interest, was a number so violently enormous that even the seasoned, deeply experienced county lawyer was about to hold his breath.
Elias did not touch the gold. He did not reach out to run his fingers through the silver coins like a common thief or a desperate man. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his black-stained hands hanging at his sides, looking at the fortune with the same stoic detachment he had used to inspect the rusted furnace. To him, this was not just wealth, it was a heavy responsibility, a tectonic shift in the gravity of their lives. He walked back down the narrow, groaning stairs and picked up the heavy black rotary telephone. Theodore Vance arrived at the Sterling mansion exactly 2 hours later. The elderly attorney did not come alone. He brought a small, elite team of 3 forensic accountants, men with sharp eyes and silver hair who moved with a quiet, clinical efficiency. They set up their workstations on the long mahogany dining table that Clara had scrubbed until it shone like a dark mirror. The silence in the room was absolute. For 5 straight hours, the only sounds were the soft rustle of aged parchment, the rhythmic clicking of high-end calculators, and the low, urgent murmurs of the experts. They examined the watermarks on the bearer bonds. They calculated the compounding interest rates from the early 20th century. They looked at the current market value of gold bullion, measured to the exact troy ounce. Elias and Clara sat together on a small wooden bench in the corner. They did not pace, they did not whisper in excited greed. They waited with the patient, unbreakable dignity of 2 people who had already survived the very worst that life could throw at them. Finally, Theodore Vance stood up. He removed his gold-rimmed spectacles and wiped his brow with a silk handkerchief. His hands, usually as steady as a surgeon's, were visibly shaking. He looked at the soot-covered old man and the woman with the silver hair, his expression one of profound, almost religious awe. "Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell," Theodore began, his voice cracking slightly, "we have finished the preliminary valuation. Between the 50 gold bars, the rare numismatic coin collection, and the accumulated interest on these specific bearer bonds, the total value is staggering." He paused, swallowing hard. "The Sterling estate is currently valued at $265 million. The number hit the room like a physical blow. $265 million. From $18 in a grease-stained pocket to a fortune that rivaled the wealth of small nations. It was a victory so absolute, so complete, that it felt as though the very laws of physics had shifted in their favor. But Theodore Vance had one more thing to reveal. He pulled a heavy, legal-sized document from his leather briefcase, a specific codicil to Aunt Eleanor's final will and testament. "There is a legal safeguard here," Theodore said, his voice regaining its professional steel. Eleanor was a woman of foresight. She included a no-contest clause. It is a titanium-clad legal barrier. It states that if any relative, known or unknown, attempts to litigate, contest, or claim a portion of this inheritance through the courts, their entire claim is immediately voided. Furthermore, the act of filing such a lawsuit triggers an automatic transfer. The entire $265 million would instantly be liquidated and donated to the state's orphans fund. It was a legal trap, a masterpiece of defensive law designed to protect the worthy from the greedy. "You are now the masters of this mountain, and you are protected by a wall of fire." Elias nodded once. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply looked at Clara and took her hand. He knew that the news of this fortune would travel through the mountains like a howling wind. He knew that the scent of gold would reach the nostrils of the wolves they had left behind. The rumor of the billion-dollar family fortune leaked almost instantly, traveling through the small towns and across the state lines.
And as Elias expected, the smell of money immediately awakened the cold-blooded son hundreds of miles away, who was even now packing a suitcase with a filthy ambition, racing towards the mansion he had once called a tomb.
The heavy black luxury sports utility vehicle tore aggressively up the steep, treacherous 3-mile mountain road, its thick winter tires spinning violently against the packed ice, throwing heavy chunks of frozen mud and white snow deep into the dark, silent tree line. Vincent gripped the heated leather steering wheel, his knuckles turning a stark white, his eyes completely consumed by a desperate, feverish greed. Beside him sat Lorraine, nervously adjusting her expensive silk scarf, her mind already calculating the endless, unimaginable luxuries she was about to purchase. In the spacious rear seat sat a high-priced corporate attorney, a man entirely accustomed to crushing the weak, carrying a heavy leather briefcase filled with aggressive, threatening legal injunctions. They parked violently in front of the colossal stone steps. Vincent leaped from the heated cabin into the biting 20-degree Fahrenheit mountain air, not even bothering to button his expensive wool coat. He bounded up the sweeping stone stairs, his polished dress shoes slipping slightly on the slick ice, and pushed open the massive oak doors without a single knock. He expected to find his parents freezing, starving, and begging for a merciful rescue. He expected a dark, rotting tomb, smelling of decay and absolute despair. He was completely wrong. The grand foyer was a breathtaking vision of restored historical majesty. The colossal cast-iron radiators hummed quietly, pumping a beautiful, steady 70 degrees Fahrenheit of dry, comfortable heat through the immense volume of the room. The Italian marble floor gleamed flawlessly under the warm golden light of restored brass chandeliers. And there, sitting upon a beautifully carved mahogany sofa, were Elias and Clara. They wore freshly purchased thick wool sweaters and clean, dark denim trousers. They did not look like victims. They did not look like frightened refugees. They looked like the absolute masters of the mountain. "Mom! Dad!" Vincent cried out, his voice dripping with a sickly, completely fabricated sweetness, painting a grotesque mask of deep concern across his pale face. "We were so incredibly worried about you." Elias did not stand up. He did not offer his calloused hand. He merely blinked his dark, heavy eyes, staring completely through the pathetic charade of his treacherous son. "You have no business being out here in this dangerous wilderness," Lorraine chimed in rapidly, her eyes darting greedily toward the towering, expensive oil paintings and the rich architectural details of the massive estate. "We brought our attorney. We know about the money, Elias. $265 million is simply too much for two sick, elderly people to manage. We are here to establish a conservatorship." Vincent took a confident step forward, dropping his fake smile entirely, replacing it with a hard, threatening glare. "You are clearly suffering from severe cognitive decline," Vincent stated aggressively, his voice a sharp, biting whip. "Sign the power of attorney over to me right now. If you refuse, we will take you to court, declare you entirely incompetent, and seize the estate by force." It was a violent, despicable threat. Elias and Clara did not flinch. They did not raise their voices in anger. They did not weep over the absolute death of their child's morality. "You may speak to our counsel," Elias murmured calmly, gesturing slightly with his right hand. From the quiet shadows of the adjacent Grand Library stepped Theodore Vance. The elderly attorney walked with slow, deliberate precision, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. He stopped exactly 6 feet away from Vincent, holding a single heavy sheet of legal parchment. "Good afternoon," Theodore said smoothly, his voice carrying the immense, crushing weight of absolute legal authority.
I am the executor of the Sterling estate, and I am afraid your expensive journey up this mountain was a complete waste of gasoline." Vincent scoffed loudly, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. "I am the direct bloodline heir, you old fool," spat Vincent venomously. "I will tie this entire property up in brutal litigation for the next 10 years if I do not get what is mine." Theodore adjusted his gold-rimmed spectacles, completely unfazed by the pathetic outburst. "You will do absolutely no such thing," Theodore replied coldly, handing the single sheet of thick parchment directly to Vincent's highly paid corporate lawyer. "You are staring at an ironclad, legally impenetrable no-contest clause, drafted by a mind far superior to yours. It specifically dictates that if any blood relative attempts to challenge, sue, or claim a conservatorship over the beneficiaries, the entirety of the inheritance, all $265 million, will instantaneously and irrevocably be liquidated and transferred to a designated charity." The corporate lawyer read the document, his face drained of all color. "He is absolutely right, Vincent," the corporate lawyer whispered frantically, taking a panicked step backward. "If you file a single piece of paper, if you even utter a threat in a courtroom, the money simply vaporizes. You get absolutely nothing. Zero." Vincent froze completely. The legal trap snapped violently shut around his neck, choking the breath right out of his lungs. He looked at the massive stone walls, the gleaming floors, the unimaginable wealth that was entirely out of his reach. Clara finally stood up. She walked slowly across the warm marble, her posture perfectly straight, her silver hair catching the golden light. She stopped directly front of the man she had birthed, the man she had starved for, the man who had thrown her into the freezing snow on Christmas Eve. She looked deeply into his flat, empty eyes, seeing absolutely nothing of the innocent child she had once sung to sleep. "I spent 54 years buying your love, trading my own flesh and my own future to build your entire existence. I am completely done paying." Vincent opened his mouth. No sound came out. "Get out of my house," Elias commanded deeply, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that echoed fiercely off the towering stone walls. Stripped of their weapons, completely robbed of their leverage, and thoroughly crushed by the unbreakable weight of the law, Vincent and Lorraine turned around. They dragged their expensive shoes across the floor, humiliated, entirely defeated, and walked back out into the bitter, freezing cold. They drove down the mountain in absolute suffocating silence. The universe possesses a flawless, terrifying memory. Exactly 1 year later, the unforgiving hammer of karma fell with absolute, devastating precision. Stripped of his parents' endless financial support and completely consumed by toxic bitterness, Vincent made a series of catastrophic, reckless investments. Lorraine, realizing the endless well of money was entirely dry, filed for a brutal divorce, taking the luxury house and half of his remaining dignity. Vincent lost absolutely everything he had ever valued in this hollow world. He was evicted from his expensive apartment. He spent his nights shivering violently in the cramped, freezing back seat of a tiny, broken-down four-door sedan, eating cold, expired canned beans. On the darkest, coldest night of December, exactly 1 year after his ultimate betrayal, he found a cracked payphone outside a dirty gas station. He dialed the number of the Sterling mansion, weeping loudly, preparing to beg his mother for just a few $100s to buy gasoline and a cheap, warm meal. The phone rang endlessly, but nobody answered. The betrayer was left completely to his ruin, returning a profound, absolute peace to the colossal snow-covered mansion, where Elias and Clara were quietly preparing to use their vast fortune to embark on one final, monumental mission.
They had $265 million resting safely in secured, heavily insured federal bank accounts. Most people would have immediately purchased massive ocean yachts, private jet airplanes, or towering glass penthouses overlooking the bright, chaotic skylines of major cities. Elias and Clara bought heavy agricultural tractors, thousands of high-quality vegetable seeds, and hundreds of thick, beautiful wool blankets. They did not desire empty, hollow luxury. They desired absolute, unyielding purpose. With the brilliant legal guidance of Theodore Vance, they completely transformed the sprawling, historical stone mansion and its surrounding 40 acres of pristine mountain land into the Second Chance Foundation. It became a massive, heavily funded community farm and a warm, impenetrable sanctuary for abandoned elderly citizens and forgotten, displaced children. The towering grand library now echoed with the bright, ringing laughter of young orphans reading ancient books. The colossal, heavy iron furnace in the basement now fiercely heated an enormous, welcoming dining hall where absolutely nobody ever had to eat a meal alone. They did not keep the Grand Master suite. They simply refused to live in a castle. Elias and Clara used their own calloused hands to build a small, incredibly modest wooden cabin on the quiet, isolated back edge of vast property, surrounded completely by towering ancient pine trees and a small, neatly planted vegetable garden. The walls were simple pine. The heat came from a modest iron wood stove. It was perfect. The late autumn sun began to dip slowly below the jagged, snow-capped mountain peaks, casting a brilliant, fiery orange glow across the sprawling 40 acres. Elias sat quietly on his handmade wooden porch chair, a warm ceramic cup of black coffee resting safely in his deeply scarred, heavy hands. He looked out over the vast, perfectly manicured green lawns. He watched elderly men and women, people who had been violently thrown away by their own selfish families, just like he had been, walking peacefully along the winding, paved stone paths, holding the small, trusting hands of smiling, rescued children. He looked further down the mountain valley. Deep in the rich, dark soil of the lower agricultural fields, a solitary man was working under the fading light. It was Vincent. Stripped entirely of his expensive tailored suits, completely bankrupted by his own towering arrogance and greedy mistakes, he now wore faded denim overalls covered in thick, wet mud. He gripped a heavy iron hoe, swinging the heavy blade down into the cold, unyielding earth with an exhausting, agonizing, endless repetition. He was earning exactly the federal minimum wage, sleeping quietly in a basic, unheated bunkhouse, willingly bleeding his own sweat into the soil to slowly buy back his fractured soul and desperately search for his lost human dignity. Elias did not hate the boy. He simply let the quiet, unforgiving mountain teach his fallen son the harsh, beautiful lessons of honest, back-breaking labor. Clara walked out onto the wooden porch, the wooden floorboards creaking softly under her feet. The biting wind had completely lost its cruel winter edge, replaced by the gentle, cooling breeze of a deeply peaceful evening. She stood right beside her husband, looking up at the towering gray smoke rising steadily from the massive mansion chimney, a beautiful beacon of absolute safety in a cold, chaotic world. She did not speak a single word. She simply smiled, a deeply serene, completely victorious smile, and gently rested her silver head against Elias's broad, unyielding shoulder. They had won. From exactly 18 worthless dollars and the freezing, bitter contempt of a heartless child, the old soot-covered couple had firmly cemented a profound, eternal truth.
Never underestimate the quiet people and the discarded things in this loud, arrogant world, because sometimes those who are buried the deepest beneath the absolute bottom of society are exactly the ones who will rise up to rebuild an entire world.